The morning of December 7, 1941, changed everything. As Japanese aircraft swept down from the Hawaiian sky like mechanical vultures, they didn't just sink battleships and kill sailors at Pearl Harbor. They shattered something far more precious to the American spirit: the belief that the homeland was untouchable, that two vast oceans provided an impenetrable shield against foreign aggression. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, as America reeled from the surprise attack, President Franklin Roosevelt faced a nation hungry for retaliation. The Japanese had struck with devastating precision, crippling the Pacific Fleet and demonstrating their military might to the world. But Japan itself remained untouched, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the seemingly impossible logistics of mounting a counterattack against the Japanese home islands. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the military casualties. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign forces had successfully attacked American territory. The myth of American invulnerability lay in ruins alongside the twisted metal of Battleship Row. Citizens on the West Coast feared invasion, blackout curtains became commonplace, and the entire nation grappled with the reality that they were now fighting a war on multiple fronts against enemies who had proven their ability to strike without warning. Roosevelt understood that military necessity demanded more than just defensive measures. America needed to demonstrate that Japan itself was vulnerable, that the empire's protective ocean barriers could be breached. The president's directive was clear and urgent: find a way to bomb Japan and find it quickly. The challenge seemed insurmountable. Traditional bombing missions required bases within range of targets, but Japan had systematically eliminated Allied airfields throughout the Pacific. Aircraft carriers could theoretically approach close enough to launch fighters, but no carrier-based aircraft possessed the range to reach meaningful targets on the Japanese mainland and return safely. The strategic situation appeared hopeless. Japan's military planners had calculated their defensive perimeter precisely, ensuring that no existing Allied aircraft could threaten the home islands from any remaining friendly territory. Wake Island had fallen, the Philippines were under siege, and Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Every day that passed without American retaliation strengthened Japanese confidence and weakened Allied morale throughout the Pacific theater. Military leaders wrestled with the impossible mathematics of the situation. Heavy bombers possessed the range and payload capacity to inflict meaningful damage on Japanese targets, but they required long runways for takeoff and landing, runways that simply didn't exist within striking distance of Japan. Carrier-based aircraft could launch from ships positioned closer to Japanese waters, but they lacked the range and bomb-carrying capacity to justify the enormous risk of bringing precious aircraft carriers within range of Japanese land-based aviation. The psychological pressure mounted as Japanese forces continued their expansion across the Pacific. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Manila was declared an open city as American and Filipino forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, was under siege. Each Japanese victory reinforced the perception of invincibility that had been established at Pearl Harbor, while America struggled to mount any meaningful offensive response. In the depths of winter 1942, as snow fell on Washington and military planners worked around the clock to devise some method of striking back at Japan, an idea began to form that would challenge every conventional assumption about naval aviation and strategic bombing. The concept emerged not from the highest levels of military command, but from the innovative thinking of a submarine officer who dared to question the fundamental limitations that had stymied America's war planners. Captain Francis Lowe of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics found himself walking across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, observing the massive vessel's capabilities and limitations. As he watched the normal operations of carrier aviation, with fighters and dive bombers launching and recovering in the endless cycle of naval air operations, a revolutionary thought struck him. What if the limitations of carrier-based aviation could be overcome not by modifying the aircraft carrier, but by fundamentally changing the type of aircraft that launched from its deck? The conventional wisdom held that aircraft carriers could only operate aircraft specifically designed for carrier operations. Planes with reinforced landing gear, tailhooks for arrested landings, and folding wings for compact storage. These design requirements necessarily limited the size, range, and payload capacity of carrier-based aircraft. But Lowe began to consider a radical alternative. What if a carrier could launch aircraft that were never intended to return to the ship? Lowe's concept centered on the possibility of launching Army Air Force's bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier. The bombers would take off from the carrier's deck, strike targets in Japan, and then continue westward to land at friendly airfields in China. This one-way mission would eliminate the need for the bombers to return to the carrier, freeing them from the weight and design constraints of carrier-based aircraft, while providing the range and payload capacity necessary for a meaningful attack on Japanese targets. The idea was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. Army bombers had never been designed for carrier operations. Their landing gear wasn't reinforced for the stress of carrier takeoffs, their wingspan might be too wide for carrier decks, and their weight could exceed the carrier's launching capabilities. Moreover, the coordination required between Army and Navy forces, traditionally separate and sometimes competing branches of the military, would present unprecedented challenges. When Lowe presented his concept to Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, the response was immediate interest tempered by serious skepticism. King recognized the potential of the idea, but understood the enormous technical and logistical challenges it would present. The Admiral directed Lowe to investigate the feasibility of the concept, beginning with the fundamental question of whether Army bombers could physically operate from aircraft carrier decks. The investigation began with careful analysis of available bomber aircraft and their specifications. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, America's premier heavy bomber, was quickly eliminated due to its size and weight. The consolidated B-24 Liberator faced similar limitations. However, the North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber presented intriguing possibilities. With a wingspan of 67 feet and a loaded weight that might be manageable for carrier operations, the Mitchell represented the best compromise between size constraints and combat capability. Initial calculations suggested that a modified B-25 might be able to take off from a carrier deck, but the margins were extremely tight. The bomber would need to be stripped of unnecessary weight, loaded with maximum fuel, and launched under perfect conditions to have any chance of success. Even then, the mission would require precise timing, favorable weather, and a significant element of luck. The concept gained momentum when it reached the attention of General Henry "Hap" Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces. Arnold immediately grasped the strategic importance of the mission and its potential impact on American morale. He also understood that success would require the selection of an exceptional leader, someone with the technical expertise to solve the mission's complex challenges and the leadership ability to inspire crews to volunteer for what was essentially a suicide mission. When General Arnold began considering potential leaders for this unprecedented mission, one name emerged as the obvious choice. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle possessed a unique combination of technical expertise, operational experience, and personal courage that made him ideally suited for the challenge ahead. At 45 years old, Doolittle had already established himself as one of America's most accomplished aviators, with a reputation for solving seemingly impossible problems through innovative thinking and meticulous preparation. Doolittle's background read like a catalogue of aviation firsts and achievements. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, making him one of the few military officers who could approach complex technical problems with both practical experience and theoretical knowledge. His dissertation on wind velocity measurement had contributed significantly to the understanding of atmospheric conditions affecting flight operations. This academic foundation provided him with analytical tools that would prove crucial in planning the mission's technical aspects. Beyond his academic credentials, Doolittle had demonstrated exceptional skill as a pilot and innovator. He had won the Schneider Trophy race in 1925, setting a new world speed record and establishing his reputation as a master of high-performance aircraft. His development of instrument flying techniques had revolutionized aviation safety, enabling pilots to operate in weather conditions that had previously grounded all aircraft. These innovations had saved countless lives and expanded the operational capabilities of military aviation. Perhaps most importantly for the mission ahead, Doolittle had proven his ability to lead men in dangerous situations while maintaining the highest standards of preparation and execution. His racing career had taught him to calculate risks precisely, pushing aircraft and crews to their limits while maintaining safety margins that ensured survival. This balance between audacity and prudence would be essential for a mission that demanded maximum performance from both men and machines. When Arnold summoned Doolittle to Washington in late January 1942, the meeting was brief and direct. Arnold outlined the basic concept of the mission without revealing specific details, emphasizing the voluntary nature of the assignment and its extremely hazardous character. Doolittle's response was immediate and unequivocal. He wanted the mission. His enthusiasm stemmed not from reckless bravado but from a clear understanding of the mission's strategic importance and confidence in his ability to solve its technical challenges. Doolittle's first task was to determine whether the mission was technically feasible. He approached this challenge with characteristic thoroughness, beginning with detailed analysis of the B-25 Mitchell's specifications and performance characteristics. The bomber's twin-engine design provided redundancy that would be crucial for long overwater flights, while its medium size offered the best compromise between payload capacity and carrier compatibility. Working with North American aviation engineers, Doolittle began developing modifications that would optimize the Mitchell for the unique requirements of the mission. Weight reduction became a primary focus, with every unnecessary component removed or replaced with lighter alternatives. The bomber's defensive armament was reduced to essential weapons only, saving hundreds of pounds that could be allocated to additional fuel. Radio equipment was simplified, navigation instruments were upgraded, and fuel systems were modified to maximize range. The human element of the mission presented equally complex challenges. Doolittle needed to recruit crews who possessed exceptional flying skills while maintaining absolute secrecy about the mission's objectives. He decided to seek volunteers from existing B-25 squadrons, looking for pilots and crew members who had demonstrated proficiency in medium bomber operations and showed the temperament necessary for extremely hazardous duty. Doolittle's approach to crew selection reflected his understanding that technical competence alone would not be sufficient for mission success. He looked for men who had demonstrated initiative, adaptability, and the ability to function effectively under extreme stress. The mission would require crews to operate in conditions far outside their normal experience, making quick decisions with incomplete information while maintaining the precision necessary for successful bombing operations. The recruitment process began with carefully worded requests for volunteers for an extremely hazardous mission of great importance. Doolittle deliberately avoided providing specific details about the mission's nature, instead focusing on the general requirements for exceptional flying skills and willingness to accept extraordinary risks. The response exceeded expectations, with far more qualified volunteers than could be accommodated by the mission's aircraft allocation. The selection of the North American B-25 Mitchell as the mission aircraft represented a careful balance between capability and constraints, but transforming this medium bomber into a carrier-capable aircraft would require extensive modifications that pushed both the aircraft and its crews to their absolute limits. The Mitchell had been designed for conventional land-based operations with no consideration for the unique demands of carrier aviation or the extreme range requirements of the proposed mission. Doolittle worked closely with North American aviation engineers to develop a comprehensive modification program that would optimize the Mitchell for its unprecedented role. The primary challenge was weight reduction, as every pound removed from the aircraft's empty weight could be converted to additional fuel capacity. This process required careful analysis of every component, system, and piece of equipment to determine what was absolutely essential for mission success. The bomber's defensive armament underwent significant revision. The standard Mitchell carried multiple machine guns for protection against fighter attacks, but the mission profile suggested that defensive firepower would be less important than maximum range. The bottom turret was completely removed, saving substantial weight while eliminating a component that would be vulnerable to damage during carrier operations. The tailgun position was retained but simplified, providing some defensive capability while reducing weight and complexity. Radio equipment presented another opportunity for weight savings while addressing the mission's unique communication requirements. Standard military radio systems were designed for routine operations with established ground stations and predictable communication patterns. The mission would require communication capabilities during the approach to Japan and coordination with Chinese forces after the bombing runs, but much of the standard radio equipment would be useless during the critical phases of the operation. Engineers developed a simplified radio package that retained essential communication capabilities while eliminating redundant systems. Navigation equipment received similar attention, with standard instruments supplemented by specialized equipment for long-range over-water navigation. The mission would require precise navigation across hundreds of miles of open ocean, followed by accurate target identification over unfamiliar terrain, demanding the highest quality navigation systems available. Fuel system modifications represented the most critical aspect of the aircraft preparation. The standard Mitchell carried sufficient fuel for medium-range bombing missions with comfortable safety margins, but the proposed mission would require every gallon of fuel that could be safely carried. Engineers designed additional fuel tanks that utilized every available space within the aircraft's structure, including areas normally occupied by crew positions and equipment storage. The additional fuel capacity came at the cost of crew comfort and safety margins. Normal fuel reserves that provided options for alternate landing sites or extended flight time were eliminated in favor of maximum range. This decision meant that crews would have essentially no margin for error in navigation, weather delays, or mechanical problems. Every aspect of the mission would need to proceed according to plan for the aircraft to reach their intended landing sites in China. Engine modifications focused on optimizing fuel consumption for maximum range rather than maximum performance. The Wright R2-600 Cyclone engines that powered the Mitchell were reliable and powerful, but their fuel consumption characteristics needed adjustment for the mission's unique requirements. Engineers developed new engine operating procedures that would provide adequate performance while extending range to the absolute maximum possible. Propeller selection and adjustment represented another critical factor in achieving maximum range. The mission would require sustained flight at optimal cruise settings rather than the varied power requirements of normal combat operations. Engineers selected propeller configurations that would provide the best efficiency at cruise power settings, even if this meant reduced performance during takeoff and climb phases. The aircraft's weight and balance characteristics required careful recalculation with the modified fuel loads and equipment configurations. The additional fuel would shift the aircraft's center of gravity significantly, affecting handling characteristics and performance throughout the flight. Pilots would need extensive training to master the aircraft's behavior with these unusual loading conditions. Landing gear modifications addressed the unique stresses of carrier operations. While the Mitchell would not need to land on a carrier deck, it would need to withstand the shock and stress of carrier takeoffs. The landing gear was reinforced to handle these loads while maintaining the weight savings achieved through other modifications. Perhaps most critically, The aircraft needed modifications to enable short takeoff performance from the carrier's limited deck space. Standard Mitchell takeoff procedures assumed long runways with ample space for acceleration and climb. The carrier deck would provide only a fraction of this distance, requiring every possible advantage in takeoff performance. The training program for the mission began in February 1942 at Eglin Field in the Florida Panhandle, a location chosen for its isolation and security as much as its training facilities. Doolittle faced the complex challenge of preparing crews for a mission whose specific details remained classified while ensuring they developed the specialized skills necessary for success. The training would need to address not only the technical aspects of flying modified aircraft under unusual conditions, but also the psychological preparation required for what many crew members suspected might be a one-way mission. Eglin Field provided the perfect environment for the intensive training program. Its remote location in the Florida wilderness offered security from prying eyes and curious reporters, while its extensive facilities could accommodate the specialized training requirements. The field's long runways could be marked to simulate the limited deck space of an aircraft carrier, providing realistic training conditions for the most critical aspect of the mission, the takeoff phase. Doolittle established a training regimen that pushed both aircraft and crews to their limits while maintaining the secrecy essential to mission success. Crews were told only that they were training for an extremely hazardous mission of great strategic importance, with specific details to be revealed only when absolutely necessary. This approach created an atmosphere of intense focus and dedication, as crew members understood they were preparing for something unprecedented in military aviation. The most critical training element focused on short takeoff procedures. Standard B-25 takeoff techniques assumed long runways with ample space for acceleration and climb. The mission would require takeoffs from a space roughly equivalent to the length of 2 football fields, with no opportunity for a second attempt if the first effort failed. Crews practiced repeatedly on runways marked to simulate carrier deck dimensions, learning to achieve maximum performance from their heavily loaded aircraft. These short takeoff procedures required fundamental changes in pilot technique and crew coordination. Pilots learned to use every available advantage, including specific flap settings, engine power management, and weight distribution techniques that would provide the maximum possible performance during the critical takeoff phase. Co-pilots and flight engineers developed new procedures for monitoring engine performance and aircraft systems during these high-stress operations. Navigation training addressed the unique challenges of long-range overwater flight, followed by target identification over unfamiliar terrain. Standard navigation techniques relied heavily on radio beacons and familiar landmarks, neither of which would be available during the mission. Crews learned celestial navigation techniques normally used by Navy aviators, supplemented by dead reckoning methods that would allow them to maintain accurate course tracking across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The navigation challenge was complicated by the need to approach Japanese targets from unexpected directions while avoiding known defensive positions. Crews studied detailed maps and photographs of potential target areas, learning to identify key landmarks and approach routes that would provide the best combination of surprise and bombing accuracy. This intelligence preparation required extensive coordination with military intelligence services, adding another layer of complexity to the training program. Bombing accuracy training focused on low-level attack techniques that would maximize the effectiveness of the limited bomb loads each aircraft could carry. Standard high-altitude bombing procedures would not be suitable for the mission, both because of the need to avoid Japanese fighter interception and because of the requirement for maximum accuracy with minimal ordnance. Crews practiced low-level bombing runs that would bring them dangerously close to their targets while providing the precision necessary for mission success. Gunnery training addressed the defensive capabilities that crews would need if intercepted by Japanese fighters. While the modified aircraft carried reduced defensive armament, The remaining guns needed to be employed with maximum effectiveness. Gunners practiced engaging targets under the high-stress conditions they might encounter over Japan, learning to coordinate their fire with evasive maneuvers by the pilot. Perhaps most importantly, the training program addressed the psychological challenges that crews would face during the mission. The knowledge that they were preparing for an extremely hazardous operation, combined with the secrecy surrounding the mission's specific objectives, created stress levels far beyond those encountered in normal training. Doolittle and his staff worked to build unit cohesion and confidence while maintaining the security essential to mission success. Crew selection continued throughout the training period as Doolittle evaluated not only technical competence but also the psychological resilience necessary for mission success. Some volunteers were reassigned to other duties when they demonstrated difficulty adapting to the mission's unique requirements, while others emerged as natural leaders who could be counted on to perform under the most extreme conditions. The training aircraft themselves underwent continuous modification and testing as engineers refined the changes necessary for mission success. Each test flight provided new data about aircraft performance under the modified configurations, leading to further adjustments in equipment, procedures, and crew training. This iterative process ensured that both aircraft and crews would be optimized for the challenges ahead. Security measures during the training period were extraordinary, reflecting the mission's strategic importance and the catastrophic consequences that would result from compromise. Crew members were restricted to the base during training, with all communications monitored and outside contacts limited. Cover stories were developed to explain the presence of Army Air Forces personnel at a location normally associated with experimental aircraft testing. As the training program progressed, crew proficiency improved dramatically, but so did the realization among participants that they were preparing for something far beyond normal military operations. The combination of intensive training, extreme secrecy, and obvious preparation for hazardous duty created an atmosphere of anticipation and determination that would prove crucial during the mission itself. The integration of Army Air Forces bombers with Navy carrier operations represented an unprecedented challenge in inter-service cooperation, requiring careful coordination between military branches that had traditionally operated independently. The selection of the USS Hornet as the launching platform reflected both the carrier's technical capabilities and its availability for the highly classified mission. Task Force 16, built around the Hornet and her escort vessels, would need to transport the modified bombers across thousands of miles of hostile ocean while maintaining the secrecy essential to mission success. Loading 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers aboard the Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California presented logistical challenges that had never been attempted in naval aviation history. The bombers were far larger than any aircraft previously carried by an aircraft carrier, requiring careful planning to ensure they could be positioned on the flight deck without interfering with the ship's operations or compromising the mission's security. The loading process began in early April 1942, with each bomber carefully positioned on the carrier's deck according to a precise plan that would allow for safe takeoff operations while maximizing the number of aircraft that could be accommodated. The bombers were secured with additional tie-downs and protective covers, as they would need to survive the stresses of ocean transit without the benefit of hangar deck protection normally provided to carrier aircraft. Doolittle and his crews boarded the Hornet with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, knowing that they were embarking on a journey that would either result in a historic military achievement or end in disaster. The Army aviators found themselves in the unfamiliar environment of a Navy warship, requiring rapid adaptation to shipboard life and procedures that were completely foreign to their land-based experience. The Hornet departed Alameda on April 2, 1942, beginning a journey that would take Task Force 16 across the Pacific toward Japanese waters. The carrier was accompanied by the cruiser Nashville, 4 destroyers, and a fleet oiler providing the escort and support necessary for the dangerous mission ahead. The task force's route was carefully planned to avoid known Japanese patrol areas while positioning the Hornet within launching range of the Japanese home islands. During the ocean transit, Doolittle's crews continued their preparation for the mission, studying target folders and refining their procedures for the bombing runs ahead. The cramped conditions aboard the carrier made training difficult, but crews used every available opportunity to review navigation procedures, bombing techniques, and emergency protocols. The Navy crew of the Hornet provided assistance and support, despite their initial skepticism about the feasibility of launching Army bombers from their flight deck. The relationship between Army and Navy personnel aboard the Hornet evolved from mutual suspicion to grudging respect as both groups recognized their shared commitment to mission success. Navy aviators initially questioned whether Army pilots possessed the skills necessary for carrier operations, while Army crews wondered whether Navy procedures would adequately support their unique requirements. These concerns gradually dissolved as both groups worked together to solve the technical and procedural challenges of the mission. Weather conditions during the Pacific crossing were generally favorable, but the task force faced the constant threat of detection by Japanese patrol aircraft or submarines. The mission's success depended entirely on achieving surprise, as Japanese defenses would be virtually impregnable if alerted to the approaching threat. Radio silence was maintained throughout the journey, with communications limited to essential operational requirements. Navigation across the vast Pacific required precise coordination between the task force's ships and careful monitoring of their position relative to the planned launch point. The Hornet needed to reach a position approximately 400 miles from the Japanese coast, close enough to ensure the bombers could reach their targets, but far enough to minimize the risk of detection and counterattack. This positioning required split-second timing and accurate navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean. As the task force approached Japanese waters, tension aboard the ships increased dramatically. Intelligence reports indicated increasing Japanese patrol activity, and the risk of detection grew with each mile closer to the launch point. Doolittle and his crews made final preparations for the mission, knowing that they might need to launch at any moment if the task force was discovered. The original plan called for a night launch on April 19th, which would allow the bombers to approach their targets under cover of darkness and provide maximum time for escape to Chinese airfields. However, events would soon force a dramatic change in these carefully laid plans, testing the adaptability and courage of everyone involved in the mission. On the morning of April 18th, approximately 650 miles from the Japanese coast, the task force encountered Japanese patrol vessels that had been positioned much farther from the home islands than intelligence estimates had predicted. The picket boat Nito Maru spotted the American ships and immediately began transmitting radio warnings to Japanese naval headquarters, compromising the mission's secrecy and forcing an immediate decision about whether to proceed with the attack. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, faced a critical choice. The early detection meant that Japanese defenses would be alerted and the bombers would face much stronger opposition than anticipated. However, cancelling the mission would waste months of preparation and eliminate America's best opportunity to strike back at Japan. After brief consultation with Doolittle, Halsey made the decision to proceed with an immediate launch, despite the increased risks and reduced chances of success. The morning of April 18, 1942, dawned grey and turbulent over the North Pacific, with 30-foot swells rolling beneath the USS Hornet as she turned into the wind for the most audacious carrier operation in naval history. The early detection by Japanese patrol vessels had compressed the mission timeline dramatically, forcing Doolittle and his crews to launch in broad daylight from a position much farther from their targets than originally planned. The margin for error, already razor-thin, had essentially disappeared. Doolittle made the decision to lead the mission personally, climbing into the cockpit of the first B-25, positioned at the front of the Hornet's flight deck. His aircraft, loaded with incendiary bombs destined for Tokyo, would serve as the pathfinder for the 15 bombers that would follow. The symbolism was not lost on the crews watching from the carrier's deck. Their commander was not asking them to take risks he was unwilling to share. The takeoff sequence began at 8:20 in the morning, with Doolittle's bomber accelerating down the pitching deck of the carrier as Navy personnel watched in fascination and terror. The heavily loaded Mitchell used every foot of available deck space, lifting off just as the carrier's bow began to rise with another massive swell. The sight of the twin-engine bomber disappearing over the carrier's bow before climbing slowly into the grey sky provided both inspiration and anxiety for the crews preparing to follow. One by one, the remaining bombers followed Doolittle into the hostile sky, each takeoff a testament to the skill of the pilots and the modifications that had transformed the Mitchell into a carrier-capable aircraft. The launches proceeded smoothly despite the challenging conditions, with all 16 aircraft successfully departing the Hornet and forming up for the long flight to Japan. The carrier immediately turned away from Japanese waters, beginning its own dangerous journey back to friendly territory. The flight to Japan tested every aspect of the crew's training and preparation. Navigation across 400 miles of open ocean required precise dead reckoning, as radio silence was essential to maintain any hope of surprise. The bombers flew at low altitude to avoid detection by Japanese radar, skimming just above the wavetops in a formation that balanced mutual support with the need to avoid presenting a concentrated target for enemy fighters. As the Japanese coastline appeared through the morning haze, crews experienced a mixture of excitement and terror that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. They were about to become the first enemy aircraft to attack the Japanese home islands since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, striking at the heart of an empire that had considered itself invulnerable to foreign attack. Doolittle's aircraft approached Tokyo from the northeast, following a route that brought them over the city's industrial districts before turning toward their primary targets. The bomber's crew observed with amazement the complete absence of defensive preparations. No fighter aircraft rose to intercept them, no anti-aircraft fire greeted their approach, and civilian populations on the ground seemed more curious than alarmed by the appearance of unfamiliar aircraft over their capital city. The bombing run over Tokyo proceeded with textbook precision, despite the crew's excitement and the surreal nature of their situation. Incendiary bombs fell on aircraft factories, oil storage facilities, and military installations, creating fires that would burn for hours and serve as visible proof that Japan's defensive perimeter had been breached. The psychological impact of the attack would far exceed the physical damage inflicted by the relatively small bomb loads carried by each aircraft. Other bombers in the formation struck targets across the Tokyo metropolitan area, with crews reporting similar experiences of complete surprise and minimal defensive response. The Japanese military had positioned their fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses to counter attacks from the south and west, where American bases in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies had been located before their capture. An attack from the northeast, launched from aircraft carriers operating in the North Pacific, had been considered impossible by Japanese strategic planners. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew, flying the second aircraft in the formation, encountered their first Japanese fighter aircraft over Tokyo Bay, but the enemy pilots seemed confused by the appearance of twin-engine bombers over the capital and failed to press an aggressive attack. This encounter highlighted the complete surprise achieved by the raid, as Japanese pilots had received no warning of approaching enemy aircraft and were unprepared for immediate combat operations. The bombers assigned to targets outside Tokyo faced longer flights over increasingly hostile territory, but they continued to benefit from the confusion and disorganization that characterized the Japanese response. Captain David Jones led his crew against targets in the Yokohama area, encountering moderate anti-aircraft fire but no fighter opposition. The industrial facilities they attacked were completely unprepared for air raids, with no blackout procedures or defensive measures in place. Lieutenant Robert Gray's aircraft struck targets in the Yokosuka Naval District, attacking shipbuilding facilities and naval installations that represented critical components of Japan's military infrastructure. The crew reported excellent bombing results, with fires visible throughout the target area as they turned away toward their escape route to China. Perhaps the most audacious attack was conducted by Lieutenant Colonel John Hilger's crew, who struck targets in Kobe and Osaka, deep in the Japanese heartland. Their flight path took them over heavily populated areas where thousands of Japanese civilians witnessed the impossible sight of American bombers operating freely over their homeland. The psychological impact of this demonstration of vulnerability would resonate throughout Japanese society for months to come. The bomber crews assigned to attack Nagoya encountered the strongest defensive response of the day, with anti-aircraft fire and fighter aircraft attempting to intercept the raiders. However, the Japanese response remained disorganized and ineffective, hampered by the complete surprise of the attack and the lack of established procedures for defending against bomber formations approaching from unexpected directions. As the bombers completed their attacks and turned toward China, crews experienced a mixture of elation and apprehension. They had successfully accomplished the impossible, striking at the heart of the Japanese Empire and demonstrating that no target was beyond the reach of American military power. However, their own survival remained very much in doubt as they faced a long flight over hostile territory with fuel supplies that provided no margin for error. The escape phase of the mission would prove even more challenging than the attack itself, as crews struggled with navigation difficulties, mechanical problems, and the growing realization that their fuel supplies might not be sufficient to reach the planned landing sites in China. The success of their attack on Japan would mean nothing if they could not survive to report their achievements and provide intelligence for future operations. The flight from Japan to China transformed from triumph to survival as the 16 bomber crews faced the harsh reality of their fuel situation and the challenges of navigation over unfamiliar territory. The early launch from the Hornet had consumed additional fuel that many aircraft could not spare, while weather conditions over China were deteriorating rapidly, threatening to make landing operations impossible even if the bombers could reach their intended destinations. Doolittle's aircraft, leading the formation toward the Chinese coast, encountered the first signs of the crisis that would engulf the entire mission. Fuel consumption was exceeding calculated rates, partly due to the stress of combat operations and partly because of headwinds that had not been anticipated in the original flight planning. The bombers' fuel gauges showed a steady decline that threatened to leave them short of any suitable landing site. As darkness fell over the Chinese coast, the situation became increasingly desperate. The planned landing sites were equipped with minimal navigation aids, and the deteriorating weather made visual approaches extremely hazardous. Radio communications with Chinese forces were sporadic and unreliable, leaving crews to navigate by dead reckoning toward airfields they had never seen and might not be able to locate in the darkness. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew was among the first to face the inevitable decision that confronted all the bomber crews, whether to attempt a dangerous night landing at an unknown airfield or to abandon their aircraft and parachute into hostile territory. Hallmark chose to continue flying until his fuel was exhausted, hoping to reach friendly territory before being forced to crash land or bail out. The crew's B-25 finally ran out of fuel over Japanese-occupied China, forcing them to parachute into territory controlled by enemy forces. Hallmark and his crew members were captured shortly after landing, beginning an ordeal that would demonstrate the brutal treatment awaiting any American airmen who fell into Japanese hands. Their capture marked the beginning of a tragic chapter that would overshadow the mission's strategic success. Doolittle's own aircraft faced similar fuel exhaustion as it approached the Chinese coast in complete darkness. The mission commander made the difficult decision to order his crew to abandon the aircraft rather than risk a crash landing that might kill everyone aboard. The crew parachuted into the mountains of China, landing in territory that was nominally under Chinese control but remained dangerous due to Japanese patrol activity and the presence of bandits who preyed on isolated travelers. Doolittle landed hard in a rice paddy, injuring his back and finding himself alone in hostile territory with no knowledge of his crew's fate or his precise location. The mission commander, who had led the most audacious air raid in military history, now faced the prospect of capture or death in the mountains of China, far from any friendly forces who might provide assistance. The scattered landings of the bomber crews across eastern China created a complex rescue and evasion situation that would test the courage and resourcefulness of both the American airmen and the Chinese civilians who risked their lives to provide assistance. Many crews found themselves in territory controlled by Chinese guerrilla forces who were fighting their own desperate war against Japanese occupation, while others landed in areas where Japanese patrols maintained tenuous control over a hostile population. Captain Ted Lawson's crew experienced one of the most harrowing crash landings of the mission when their fuel-starved bomber struck the water just off the Chinese coast. The impact severely injured several crew members, including Lawson himself, who suffered injuries that would eventually require the amputation of his leg. The crew struggled ashore in darkness, beginning a journey through enemy territory that would test their endurance and the loyalty of Chinese civilians who discovered them. The Chinese response to the crashed American airmen demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion in the face of brutal Japanese reprisals. Civilians who assisted the American crews faced torture and execution if discovered by Japanese forces, yet thousands of Chinese citizens risked their lives to provide food, shelter, medical care, and guidance to safety. This assistance came at a terrible cost as Japanese forces launched savage reprisal campaigns against Chinese communities suspected of helping the American raiders. Lieutenant Robert Hite's crew faced capture after their aircraft crash-landed in Japanese-occupied territory. Along with Hallmark's crew and Lieutenant William Farrow's crew, they would endure months of brutal interrogation and imprisonment that violated every principle of international law regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. The Japanese military's decision to treat the captured airmen as war criminals rather than legitimate prisoners would have far-reaching consequences for the conduct of the Pacific War. The interrogation and torture of the captured American airmen revealed the depth of Japanese anger and humiliation over the successful raid on their homeland. Military officials who had assured the emperor and the Japanese people that the home islands were invulnerable to enemy attack now faced the impossible task of explaining how American bombers had struck at the heart of the empire with complete impunity. 8 of the captured airmen would eventually be executed by their Japanese captors, despite their status as legitimate prisoners of war conducting military operations against valid targets. The executions were carried out in secret, with Japanese authorities providing false information about the airmen's fate to international observers. These war crimes would not be fully revealed until after Japan's surrender, when Allied investigators uncovered evidence of the systematic mistreatment and murder of the Doolittle Raiders. Meanwhile, the majority of the bomber crews who had successfully evaded capture began the long journey back to Allied territory with the assistance of Chinese guerrilla forces and civilian volunteers. The escape routes led through some of the most dangerous territory in China, where Japanese patrols, Chinese bandits, and the constant threat of betrayal made every mile a potential death trap. Doolittle himself was rescued by Chinese forces after spending several days hiding in the mountains, uncertain whether any of his crews had survived the mission. The reunion with other survivors provided both relief and anguish, as reports filtered in about crews who had been captured or killed during the escape attempt. The mission commander, who had led his men into the most dangerous operation of their lives, now faced the responsibility of accounting for their fate. The journey back to Allied territory took weeks for most survivors, involving travel through Japanese-occupied areas, across battle lines, and through regions where central authority had completely collapsed. The American airmen depended entirely on the courage and loyalty of Chinese guides who risked everything to help them reach safety, often traveling at night and hiding during daylight hours to avoid Japanese patrols. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, later described the escape journey as more terrifying than the raid itself, as the constant threat of capture or betrayal created stress levels that exceeded even the tension of flying over Japan. The airmen had been trained for combat operations but not for survival in hostile territory, making their dependence on Chinese assistance absolute and their gratitude profound. The successful return of most crew members to Allied territory provided intelligence that would prove invaluable for future operations against Japan. The raiders brought back detailed observations of Japanese defensive preparations, civilian morale, and military capabilities that helped Allied planners develop more effective strategies for the air war against the Japanese home islands. However, the human cost of the mission extended far beyond the American casualties. Japanese reprisal campaigns against Chinese civilians who had assisted the raiders resulted in the deaths of an estimated 250,000 Chinese men, women, and children. Entire villages were destroyed, and brutal torture was employed against anyone suspected of providing aid to the American airmen. This savage response demonstrated the extent to which the raid had shaken Japanese confidence and the lengths to which they would go to prevent future assistance to Allied forces. The psychological impact of the Doolittle Raid on Japanese military leadership and civilian population far exceeded the physical damage inflicted by the 16 bombers, creating a crisis of confidence that would influence Japanese strategic decisions for the remainder of the war. The successful penetration of Japan's defensive perimeter by American aircraft demonstrated that the Empire's protective barriers were not impregnable, shattering the myth of invulnerability that had sustained Japanese morale since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Emperor Hirohito's reaction to news of the raid reflected the profound shock that reverberated through Japan's highest levels of government and military command. The emperor, who had been assured by his military advisors that the home islands were completely secure from enemy attack, demanded immediate explanations for the security failure that had allowed American bombers to strike at the heart of his empire. The inability of Japanese forces to prevent or effectively respond to the raid called into question the competence of military leaders who had promised absolute protection for the homeland. General Hideki Tojo, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister and War Minister, faced a crisis that threatened both his political position and Japan's strategic position in the Pacific War. The raid had occurred despite massive investments in defensive preparations and the deployment of thousands of aircraft and personnel to protect the home islands. Tojo's government had staked its credibility on the promise that Japan proper would never face enemy attack, making the successful American raid a devastating blow to official prestige. The Japanese military's response to the raid revealed the depth of their shock and the extent to which the attack had disrupted their strategic planning. Fighter aircraft that had been positioned to defend against attacks from the south and west were hastily redeployed to cover approaches from the northeast, weakening defenses in other critical areas. Anti-aircraft gun emplacements were expanded around major cities, diverting resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations that had previously been considered unnecessary. Perhaps most significantly, the raid forced Japanese naval leadership to reconsider their strategic priorities in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most respected naval strategist, recognized that the American raid demonstrated capabilities that threatened Japan's ability to maintain its defensive perimeter. The successful carrier-based attack suggested that American naval forces possessed both the technical capability and operational audacity to strike at targets previously considered beyond their reach. Yamamoto's response to the Doolittle Raid would have profound consequences for the course of the Pacific War. Convinced that Japan needed to eliminate American carrier forces before they could mount additional attacks on the homeland, Yamamoto accelerated planning for a decisive naval battle that would destroy the remaining American fleet. This decision led directly to the Battle of Midway, where Japanese overconfidence and strategic miscalculation would result in a catastrophic defeat that marked the beginning of Japan's decline in the Pacific. The civilian population's reaction to the raid created additional problems for Japanese authorities, who had assured their people that enemy forces could never threaten the sacred soil of Japan. Witnesses to the bombing runs reported their experiences despite official attempts to minimize the significance of the attack, creating rumors and speculation that undermined confidence in government assurances about the war's progress. Japanese propaganda efforts to downplay the raid's significance were hampered by the undeniable evidence of American bombs exploding in the heart of Tokyo and other major cities. Official statements claiming that the attack had been repelled with heavy losses to American forces were contradicted by the obvious fact that enemy aircraft had operated freely over Japan for several hours without encountering effective resistance. The raid's impact on Japanese industrial production extended beyond the physical damage inflicted by the bombs themselves. Factory workers who had witnessed American aircraft overhead began to question assurances about their safety, leading to decreased productivity and increased absenteeism in critical war industries. The psychological effect of knowing that enemy bombers could appear without warning created a climate of anxiety that affected civilian morale throughout the war. Military leaders struggled to explain how American forces had achieved complete surprise despite Japan's extensive intelligence networks and defensive preparations. The raid had demonstrated fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking, particularly the assumption that geographic barriers provided absolute protection against enemy attack. This revelation forced a comprehensive reassessment of defensive strategies and resource allocation that diverted attention and materials from offensive operations. The international implications of the raid were equally significant, as neutral nations and potential allies observed Japan's inability to protect its own territory from enemy attack. The demonstration of American capability to strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire encouraged resistance movements throughout occupied Asia and undermined Japanese efforts to present themselves as the inevitable victors in the Pacific conflict. Intelligence analysis of the raid revealed to Japanese planners that American industrial capacity and technological innovation were advancing more rapidly than they had anticipated. The successful modification of land-based bombers for carrier operations demonstrated engineering capabilities that suggested American forces would continue to develop new methods of attack that could circumvent existing Japanese defenses. The raid also exposed critical weaknesses in Japanese command and control systems, as the confused and ineffective response to the attack revealed poor coordination between different military services and inadequate preparation for defending against unconventional threats. These systemic problems would plague Japanese forces throughout the remainder of the war, contributing to a series of strategic defeats that ultimately led to Japan's surrender. The Doolittle Raid's influence on American morale and strategic thinking proved to be as significant as its impact on Japanese confidence, providing the United States with its first major psychological victory in the Pacific War and demonstrating that innovative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The successful attack on Japan transformed the American public's perception of the war from defensive desperation to offensive possibility, creating momentum that would sustain the nation through the long and costly campaigns ahead. President Roosevelt's announcement of the raid's success provided the American people with proof that their military forces could strike back at the enemy who had attacked Pearl Harbor. The president's famous statement that the bombers had taken off from Shangri-La captured the public imagination while maintaining the operational security necessary to protect the Navy's carrier forces. The mysterious nature of the mission's origins added to its psychological impact, suggesting that American forces possessed capabilities that could surprise and confound their enemies. The raid's success validated the concept of inter-service cooperation that would become essential to Allied victory in the Pacific. The unprecedented collaboration between Army Air Forces and Navy personnel demonstrated that traditional service rivalries could be overcome when strategic necessity demanded innovative solutions. This cooperation would serve as a model for future joint operations that combined the unique capabilities of different military branches to achieve objectives that neither could accomplish alone. Military leaders throughout the Allied forces studied the raid's planning and execution for lessons that could be applied to future operations. The successful modification of land-based aircraft for carrier operations opened new possibilities for extending the reach of naval aviation, while the demonstration of long-range precision bombing capabilities influenced strategic planning for the air war against Japan. The raid's impact on American industrial production was immediate and substantial as workers in aircraft factories and shipyards gained renewed confidence in their contribution to the war effort. The knowledge that American-built aircraft had successfully attacked the Japanese homeland provided tangible proof that their labor was directly contributing to military success, leading to increased productivity and reduced absenteeism in critical war industries. Perhaps most importantly, the raid established a precedent for the kind of innovative, high-risk operations that would characterize American military strategy throughout the Pacific War. The willingness to attempt seemingly impossible missions using unconventional methods became a hallmark of American military planning, leading to successes that repeatedly surprised and confounded Japanese strategic planners. The international community's reaction to the raid reinforced America's position as a major power capable of projecting force across vast distances to strike at enemy targets. Allied nations gained confidence in American military capabilities, while neutral countries began to reassess their positions as the balance of power in the Pacific shifted toward the United States. The raid's legacy extended far beyond its immediate military and psychological effects, influencing the development of strategic bombing doctrine and long-range aviation capabilities that would prove crucial in the final defeat of Japan. The successful demonstration that enemy homelands could be attacked from great distances using innovative delivery methods laid the groundwork for the massive bombing campaigns that would eventually bring Japan to its knees. The courage and sacrifice of the Chinese civilians who assisted the raiders became an enduring symbol of international cooperation in the fight against fascism. Their willingness to risk everything to help American airmen escape demonstrated the global nature of the struggle against Japanese militarism and the bonds that united all peoples fighting for freedom. The Doolittle Raid stands as one of the most audacious and influential military operations in history, proving that determination, innovation, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The 16 bombers that took off from the USS Hornet on that grey April morning in 1942 carried more than bombs. They carried the hopes and determination of a nation that refused to accept defeat. The raid's success changed the trajectory of the Pacific War, forcing Japan onto the defensive and providing America with the confidence and momentum necessary to begin the long march toward victory. The psychological impact of demonstrating that Japan itself was vulnerable to attack proved to be worth far more than the physical damage inflicted by the bombs themselves. Today, the Doolittle Raid is remembered not just as a military operation, but as a testament to the power of human ingenuity and courage in the face of overwhelming challenges. The men who volunteered for this mission knew they were embarking on what might be a one-way journey, yet they pressed forward because they understood that some objectives are worth any risk. Their legacy reminds us that in the darkest hours of conflict, when conventional solutions seem inadequate and defeat appears inevitable, the combination of innovative thinking, careful preparation, and unwavering courage can achieve the impossible. The Doolittle Raiders proved that no target is beyond reach when free people unite in defense of their values and their future. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most daring missions, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Prisoners from History for more incredible stories of courage, sacrifice, and human determination in the face of impossible odds. Your support helps us continue bringing these important historical stories to life, ensuring that the courage of people like the Doolittle Raiders is never forgotten.